The storm was already howling when Richard pulled over and told me to get out of the car. "She's waiting for me," he said, not even looking at me as the rain hammered the windshield. "You can figure out your own way home." I stared at him in disbelief as he reached across me to open my door, the wind nearly ripping it from its hinges. 37 years of marriage, and he was leaving me on a deserted highway in the middle of a thunderstorm because his 28-year-old girlfriend had texted him that she was scared and needed him right now. I should have seen it coming, really. The signs had been there for months, maybe even years if I'm being honest with myself. Richard had become increasingly distant, increasingly critical, increasingly eager to find fault with everything I did. When I cooked his favorite dinner, the meat was too dry. When I suggested we take a weekend trip together, he suddenly had urgent work commitments. When I tried to talk to him about our future, about retirement plans or maybe downsizing the house, he'd wave me off with an irritated gesture and tell me he didn't have time for my endless planning sessions. But even knowing all of that, even sensing that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, I never imagined he would literally abandon me in a storm. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the kind of driving rain that makes it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I grabbed my purse and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, my shoes immediately soaking through as I sank into a puddle I hadn't seen in the darkness. Richard didn't even wait for me to close the door properly before he peeled away, his taillights disappearing into the storm like red eyes blinking shut. I stood there for a moment, water dripping from my hair down my neck, trying to process what had just happened. My husband of 37 years had just left me stranded on Highway 47, 100 miles from home, in the worst storm we'd had all year. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, but of course there was no signal. Not out here in the middle of nowhere, with cell towers probably knocked out by the wind anyway. The nearest town was Millfield, maybe 15 miles back the way we'd come, but I couldn't even see the road properly through the rain. Cars were few and far between on this stretch of highway even in good weather, and in conditions like this, most sensible people were safely inside somewhere warm and dry. Unlike me, apparently. That's when I started walking. Not because I had any grand plan or because I thought I could actually make it 15 miles in this weather, but because standing still felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to give up yet. Each step was a small act of defiance against the man who thought he could just discard me like an old coat he'd grown tired of wearing. My feet squelched in my ruined shoes, and my lightweight jacket was already soaked through, but I kept moving forward, one step at a time, because what else was I going to do? The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard and I had been driving home from a marriage counseling session when he decided to abandon me. Dr. Martinelli had suggested we take this weekend trip together, just the two of us, to reconnect and remember why you fell in love in the first place. Richard had agreed with such enthusiasm that I'd actually felt hopeful for the first time in months. We'd driven up to that little bed and breakfast in Cedar Falls, the same one where we'd spent our 5th anniversary all those years ago. For a brief, shining moment, I thought maybe we could find our way back to each other. But the weekend had been a disaster from the very beginning. Richard spent most of Saturday on his phone, claiming he was dealing with work emergencies, but I could see from the way his face lit up when he read certain messages that this wasn't about work at all. When I suggested we take a walk around the lake like we used to do, he said he was too tired. When I mentioned maybe getting dinner at that little Italian place we'd loved so much, he said he wasn't hungry. By Sunday morning, I could feel the familiar knot of anxiety forming in my chest, the one that had become my constant companion over the past year. The final straw came when I found him texting someone while I was in the shower. I wasn't snooping, I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. His phone was right there on the bathroom counter, buzzing insistently, and I could see the preview messages on the lock screen. "I miss you so much, baby. Can't wait to hold you again. This weekend is torture without you." I stood there dripping wet, reading those words, and something inside me just broke. Not broke like I was shattered or defeated, but broke like a dam breaking, releasing something that had been building pressure for far too long. When I confronted him about it, Richard didn't even try to deny it. He actually seemed relieved that I'd found out, like he'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending. "Her name is Jessica," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at me with something that might have been pity. "I met her at the gym 6 months ago. She makes me feel alive again, Linda. She makes me feel like the man I used to be before everything got so complicated and routine and predictable." Predictable. That's what 37 years of marriage had become to him. Predictable. Never mind that I'd supported him through law school, working 2 jobs while he studied for the bar exam. Never mind that I'd raised our 3 children practically single-handed while he built his practice, attending every soccer game and piano recital alone because he was always too busy with clients. Never mind that I'd moved across the country twice for his career opportunities, leaving behind friends and family and starting over each time without complaint. All of that was just predictable to him now. "I want a divorce," he said, and his voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing what to have for lunch. "I'm sorry, Linda, but I can't keep pretending anymore. Jessica and I were planning to move in together. I've already talked to a lawyer." Of course he had. Richard never did anything without planning it out first, without making sure all his legal bases were covered. That's what made him such a good attorney, and apparently what made him such a thorough cheater. While I'd been worrying about our marriage and suggesting counseling and trying to figure out how to reconnect with him, he'd been methodically planning his exit strategy. The weekend trip wasn't an attempt to save our marriage. It was his way of easing his conscience before he blew up our entire life. The drive home had been silent for the first hour. I'd sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the darkening sky and trying to process everything that had just happened. My marriage was over. After 37 years, it was just over. Richard was in love with someone else, someone young enough to be our daughter, someone who made him feel alive in ways that I apparently no longer could. I thought about our children, Sarah and Michael and David, and how I was going to tell them that their father had found a new woman and their parents were getting divorced. I thought about the house, our beautiful 4-bedroom colonial that we bought when Michael was born, the house where I'd raised our family and hosted countless dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Would I have to sell it? Would I be able to afford to keep it on my own? That's when Richard's phone started buzzing with text messages. At first he ignored them, but they kept coming one after another, and finally he picked up the phone to read them. His whole demeanor changed instantly. He sat up straighter, his grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I could see his jaw clench in the dim light from the dashboard. Then he was pulling over to the side of the road, right there in the middle of the storm, and telling me to get out. "She's scared," he said, as if that explained everything. "The storm knocked out her power and she's all alone in that apartment. She needs me right now." "I'm your wife," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they didn't matter anymore. I wasn't his wife in any way that counted. I was just an obligation, a complication, something standing between him and the woman he actually wanted to be with. So there I was, walking along Highway 47 in the worst storm of the year, my clothes soaked through and my marriage officially over. Each step felt like a small rebellion against the man who thought he could just dispose of me like an unwanted piece of luggage. The rain was so heavy now that I could barely see the road, and I had to feel my way along the guardrail to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. My phone was completely dead. The moisture had gotten to it somehow, and I was starting to shiver uncontrollably. That's when I saw the lights up ahead. Not the headlights of an approaching car, but the warm yellow glow of windows, the kind of light that promises warmth and safety and human kindness. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a small building, some kind of roadside establishment with a neon sign that flickered weakly in the storm. I couldn't read what it said through the rain, but it didn't matter. It was shelter, and right now that was all I needed. The building turned out to be a truck stop, one of those old-fashioned places with a diner attached and a small motel out back. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of 18-wheelers and an old pickup truck, but the lights were on and I could see people moving around inside. I pushed through the heavy glass door, and suddenly I was standing in warmth and brightness, dripping puddles onto the worn linoleum floor while a handful of truckers and the night shift waitress turned to stare at me. "Good Lord, honey, what happened to you?" The waitress was a woman about my age, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag said Dolores, and she was already reaching for a stack of paper towels before I could even answer. "My husband," I started to say, and then stopped, because how do you explain to a stranger that your husband of 37 years just abandoned you in a storm for his 28-year-old girlfriend? How do you put something like that into words without sounding like you're making it up? But Dolores took one look at my face and seemed to understand everything without needing the details. "Men," she said, and it wasn't a question. She handed me the towels and guided me to a booth in the back corner, away from the curious stares of the truckers. "Coffee?" she asked, and when I nodded, she was back in minutes with a steaming mug and a slice of apple pie I hadn't asked for but suddenly desperately needed. "Phone's behind the counter if you need to call someone," Dolores said, settling into the booth across from me with her own cup of coffee. "Though I should warn you, most of the cell towers between here and Millfield are down. Storm knocked them out about an hour ago." I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into my fingers, and realized I didn't actually have anyone to call anyway. My sister lived in Florida, my parents had been gone for years, and my children were all scattered across the country with their own lives and families. Richard had been my emergency contact, my person to call in a crisis, and he was the one who had created this crisis in the first place. "I'm stranded," I told Dolores, because it seemed like the simplest way to explain my situation. "My husband left me here and I don't have a way to get home." Dolores studied my face for a moment, and I could see her weighing whether to ask for more details or just accept what I'd told her at face value. She chose kindness. "Well, you're not going anywhere tonight anyway," she said. "This storm's supposed to keep up until morning at least. Lucky for you, we've got rooms in the motel out back. Nothing fancy, but they're clean and warm and the heat works." The room cost $47, which was almost all the cash I had in my wallet, but it felt like the best money I'd ever spent. Dolores walked me across the parking lot under a large umbrella, unlocked the door to room 7, and handed me extra towels and a bar of soap. "Breakfast starts at 6 in the diner," she said. "And don't worry about payment until you're ready to leave. Sometimes people need a little grace, and tonight you're one of those people." I stood under the hot shower for a long time, letting the water wash away the rain and the cold and some of the shock of what had happened. When I finally emerged, wrapped in the thin but warm motel towels, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was surprised by what I saw. I'd expected to look defeated, broken, like a woman whose husband had just abandoned her for a younger woman. Instead, I looked different. Not broken exactly, but changed. There was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in a long time, something that looked almost like determination. I called Richard's office from the room phone, not because I expected him to answer, but because I needed to leave a message that would make it clear I wasn't going to just disappear quietly. His voicemail picked up after 4 rings, and I listened to his professional, courteous greeting before speaking. "Richard, it's Linda. In case you're wondering, I didn't die on the highway tonight, no thanks to you. I found shelter at a truck stop and I'm safe. I wanted you to know that abandoning your wife of 37 years in a thunderstorm is probably not going to look good in divorce proceedings. I'll be in touch." I hung up and immediately felt better. Not good exactly, but better. Stronger. Like I'd taken the first step in what was going to be a very long journey. But at least I was moving in the right direction. The next morning dawned clear and bright, like the storm had washed all the ugliness out of the world and left everything sparkling clean. I had breakfast at the diner, scrambled eggs and toast and coffee that was better than it had any right to be, and called my sister Carol in Tampa to explain what had happened. Carol had never liked Richard, had always said he was too self-absorbed and controlling, but she was wise enough not to say "I told you so" when I told her about Jessica and the divorce and being abandoned in the storm. "You can come stay with me," she offered immediately. "I've got plenty of room, and you know you're always welcome here." But I surprised myself by saying no. Not because I didn't appreciate the offer, but because running away to Florida felt like admitting defeat, like letting Richard drive me out of the life I'd built. I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Instead, I called a taxi from Millfield to come pick me up. It cost me almost $200 to get home. Money I couldn't really afford to spend, but I needed to get back to my house, my space, my territory. I needed to figure out what came next, and I couldn't do that from a motel room or my sister's guest bedroom. The house felt different when I walked through the front door. Not just empty, Richard was obviously not there, but somehow smaller, less significant. For 37 years, this house had been the center of my universe, the place where I'd focused all my energy and attention and love. Now it just felt like a building, for walls and a roof and a mortgage that I probably couldn't afford on my own. Richard's belongings were gone. Not all of them. He'd left behind most of his books and some of his older clothes, but the important things, the things that mattered to him, had been removed with surgical precision. His good watch wasn't on the dresser where he always left it. His laptop was missing from his desk. The framed photo of us from our last anniversary dinner was gone, replaced by a gap on the bookshelf that seemed to mock everything we'd once meant to each other. I found the note on the kitchen counter, propped up against the coffee maker like he was leaving instructions for a house sitter. "Linda," it began, and I almost laughed at the formality of it. After 37 years, I'd become Linda instead of Lynn or Honey, or any of the dozen other names he'd called me over the years. "I've moved in with Jessica temporarily, while we look for a place together. I think it's best if we handle the divorce through our lawyers rather than trying to work things out between us. I've retained James Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I suggest you find your own representation. I'll be in touch about dividing our assets and handling the house situation. I hope you understand that this is what's best for both of us in the long run." He'd signed it Richard. Not Love Richard or even your husband Richard, just Richard. Like he was a stranger informing me of a business decision. I sat at the kitchen table reading that note over and over, and with each reading I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and fresh and overwhelming, but it was being joined by something else. Anger, yes, but more than that. A kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. Richard thought he could just announce his decision and expect me to go along with it quietly. He thought he could abandon me in a storm and then dictate the terms of our divorce like I was some junior associate in his law firm. He was wrong. I called my daughter Sarah first because she was the oldest and because she'd always been good in a crisis. She listened without interrupting while I told her everything that had happened, from the weekend trip to the truck stop to coming home to find Richard's note. "Mom," she said when I finished, and her voice was tight with an anger I rarely heard from her. "Mom, what he did to you is unconscionable. Abandoning you in a storm like that. There are laws about that kind of thing. You could probably have him charged with endangerment or something." "I don't want to have him arrested," I said. "I just want out of this marriage with some dignity and some security." "Then you need a lawyer," Sarah said firmly. "And not just any lawyer. You need someone who specializes in high-asset divorces, someone who knows how to deal with men like Dad, who think they can just take what they want and leave their wives with nothing." She was right, of course. Richard was a lawyer, which meant he knew exactly how to protect his assets and minimize his obligations. If I went into this divorce without proper representation, I'd end up with nothing but the crumbs he decided to throw my way. That wasn't going to happen. Sarah recommended Rebecca Chun, a divorce attorney she'd heard about through her work at the women's shelter. "She's expensive," Sarah warned, "but she's supposed to be absolutely ruthless when it comes to protecting her clients. They call her the Shark." The Shark's office was in downtown Phoenix, in one of those gleaming glass towers that radiated money and power. Rebecca Chun was a small woman, probably in her 50s, with perfectly styled black hair and a handshake that could crack walnuts. She listened to my story without taking notes, asking pointed questions that made me realize just how calculating Richard's behavior had been. "So he's been planning this for at least 6 months, she said when I finished. "Long enough to hide assets, move money around, maybe even establish residency in a different state if that would benefit him. And the abandonment during the storm, that shows a pattern of emotional abuse and endangerment that we can definitely use." "I don't want to destroy him," I said. "I just want what's fair." Rebecca smiled, and it wasn't a particularly warm expression. "Mrs. Patterson, after 37 years of marriage, what's fair is going to feel like destruction to your husband. Half of everything he considers his is actually yours. Half of his retirement account, half of his business assets, half of the value of your home. And given his behavior, the adultery, the abandonment, the way he's trying to steamroll you into a quick settlement, I think we can do better than half." She was right about Richard trying to rush the settlement. His lawyer, James Morrison, called my lawyer within a week with an offer that was insulting in its inadequacy. Richard was proposing to give me the house, with its substantial mortgage, and a token spousal support payment that would last for exactly 2 years. In exchange, I would waive any claim to his retirement accounts, his business, or any of the investment properties he'd been buying over the past few years. "Investment properties?" I asked Rebecca. "What investment properties?" That's when we discovered just how busy Richard had been preparing for his new life. Over the past 2 years, he'd purchased 3 rental properties in Jessica's name. using money from accounts I didn't even know existed. He'd also moved a substantial portion of his retirement savings into offshore accounts, and had been systematically undervaluing his law practice by deferring billings and delaying collections. He's been planning this for much longer than 6 months, Rebecca told me after her investigator had finished digging through Richard's finances. This level of asset concealment takes years to set up properly. Your husband has been preparing to divorce you since at least 2019, possibly earlier. That was the year I'd suggested we renew our wedding vows for our 35th anniversary. Richard had said he thought it was a silly idea, that we didn't need grand gestures to prove our commitment to each other. Now I understood why he'd been so dismissive of the idea. He was already planning his exit. The discovery process was like performing an autopsy on my marriage. Every document Rebecca's team uncovered revealed another layer of Richard's deception, another way he'd been systematically stealing from our shared future to build a new life with Jessica. The gym membership where he'd met her? Paid for with money from our joint account. The weekend trips he claimed were for work? Actually romantic getaways, charged to a credit card I'd never seen. Even the marriage counseling sessions Richard had been paying Dr. Martinelli with funds he'd been hiding from me. But the most devastating discovery came when we subpoenaed Richard's phone records. The affair with Jessica hadn't started 6 months ago, as he'd claimed. It had been going on for almost 2 years. 2 years during which he'd been coming home to me every night, eating the dinners I cooked, sleeping in the bed we shared, all while conducting an elaborate secret relationship with a woman half his age. 2 years during which I'd been worrying about our marriage and suggesting counseling and trying to figure out how to reconnect with him, never knowing that he'd already checked out completely. There were hundreds of text messages between them, emails, photos. Rebecca's investigator had compiled them into a comprehensive file that read like a romance novel. If romance novels were written by middle-aged lawyers trying to impress much younger women with expensive gifts and promises of exotic travel. Richard had been sending Jessica flowers every week, jewelry for her birthday, money for her rent when she was between jobs. He'd promised to take her to Paris for her 29th birthday, to buy her a car, to set her up in a luxury apartment once he was free of his complicated situation at home. His complicated situation at home. That's what I was to him. A complication to be managed and eventually discarded. But Rebecca was right about one thing. All of Richard's careful planning was about to backfire spectacularly. Because while he'd been focused on hiding assets and building his secret life, he'd also been creating a paper trail that documented his fraud and deception in excruciating detail. Every hidden account, every secret purchase, every lie he'd told about his whereabouts was going to be exposed in court. "We're going to crucify him," Rebecca told me with obvious satisfaction. "Adultery, financial fraud, emotional abuse, abandonment. Your husband has given us everything we need to take him apart piece by piece." The first settlement conference was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February. Richard showed up in his best suit, looking confident and relaxed, like a man who expected to walk away with most of his assets intact. He even brought Jessica with him, which Rebecca said was either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant. Probably both. I'd been dreading seeing them together, but when the moment came, I felt surprisingly little emotion. Jessica was pretty in an unremarkable way, with blonde highlights and too much makeup and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're in over your head. She kept glancing at Richard for approval, like a child seeking validation from a parent. Watching them together, I realized that this wasn't some great love affair that had swept Richard off his feet. This was a middle-aged man having a very expensive midlife crisis. The conference itself was a masterclass in legal warfare. James Morrison opened with the same insulting offer Richard had made before, apparently expecting me to be so intimidated by the formal setting that I'd just accept whatever they proposed. Instead, Rebecca spent the next hour methodically destroying every assumption they'd made about my willingness to cooperate. She started with the offshore accounts, laying out bank statements and transfer records that showed exactly how much money Richard had hidden and when. Then came the investment properties, complete with documentation showing that while they were technically in Jessica's name, Richard had provided all the funding and made all the management decisions. Finally, she presented the phone records and text messages, painting a picture of a man who had systematically defrauded his wife while conducting an elaborate affair. "Your client," Rebecca said to James Morrison, has committed what amounts to financial rape. He has stolen marital assets, hidden income, and abandoned his wife in a life-threatening situation. My client is not interested in a quick settlement. We're going to trial, and when we do, all of this is going to become public record. Mr. Patterson's colleagues, his clients, his golf buddies, they're all going to know exactly what kind of man he is. Richard's face went white. His law practice depended on his reputation in the community, on being seen as trustworthy and ethical. Having the details of his affair and his financial deception spread across the local legal community would be devastating to his career. Perhaps we should take a break, James Morrison suggested weakly. During the recess, I watched Richard and Jessica huddled in the hallway, their voices low but their body language screaming panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Richard had expected me to be grateful for whatever scraps he was willing to throw my way. He'd thought I would be so devastated by the end of our marriage that I'd sign whatever papers he put in front of me, just to get it over with. He was wrong about that too. When they came back to the table, James Morrison had a new offer. Half of Richard's retirement account, half of the equity in our home, and spousal support for 5 years instead of 2. It was better, but it still didn't account for the hidden assets or the money Richard had spent on Jessica during their affair. Not even close, Rebecca said coolly. Let me make our position clear. My client wants 70% of all marital assets, including the hidden properties and offshore accounts. She wants lifetime spousal support set at 40% of your client's current income, with annual cost of living adjustments. And she wants reimbursement for every penny your client spent on his mistress during their affair. That's completely unreasonable, James Morrison sputtered. What's unreasonable, Rebecca replied, is stealing from your wife of 37 years to fund an affair with a woman young enough to be your daughter. What's unreasonable is abandoning that wife on a highway during a thunderstorm. What's unreasonable is trying to hide assets and defraud the court. My client has been more than reasonable. Your client has been criminal. We went to trial in May. Richard had hoped to avoid the publicity of a public trial, but his settlement offers never came close to what I deserved, so we ended up in court anyway. The local newspaper covered the proceedings because Richard was well known in the legal community, and the story of a prominent attorney abandoning his wife in a storm made for compelling headlines. The trial lasted 3 days, and it was everything Rebecca had promised it would be. She presented our case like she was prosecuting a criminal rather than litigating a divorce. Every piece of evidence was laid out methodically. Every lie Richard had told was exposed in detail. By the time she was finished, Richard looked like exactly what he was. A selfish, greedy man who had betrayed every vow he'd ever made. Richard's testimony was particularly devastating. James Morrison had clearly coached him to appear contrite and responsible, but under Rebecca's cross-examination, his true character came through. When she asked him about the night he'd abandoned me, he actually tried to justify it by saying that Jessica had been genuinely frightened and needed him more than I did. Your wife of 37 years was stranded on a highway in a thunderstorm, Rebecca said. And you thought your girlfriend's fear of the dark took priority. Jessica is much younger, Richard said, as if that explained everything. She doesn't have Linda's experience with handling difficult situations. What experience is that, Mr. Patterson? The experience of being abandoned by someone who claimed to love her. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Hawkins, looked like she wanted to climb down from the bench and throttle Richard with her bare hands. She'd been married for 40 years herself, and I could see in her face that Richard's behavior struck her as particularly despicable. When Judge Hawkins announced her ruling, it was even better than what Rebecca had asked for. I was awarded 75% of all marital assets, including the hidden properties and offshore accounts. I got lifetime spousal support set at 45% of Richard's income, with annual adjustments. The house was mine, free and clear, and Richard was ordered to pay all of my attorney's fees. Additionally, he was required to reimburse me for every penny he'd spent on Jessica during their affair, a sum that totaled more than $60,000. Mr. Patterson, Judge Hawkins said as she announced her decision, your behavior throughout this marriage and during these proceedings has been reprehensible. You systematically defrauded your wife, conducted an affair using marital assets, and abandoned her in circumstances that could have resulted in serious injury or death. This court will not reward such conduct with a favorable settlement. Richard was ordered to turn over all hidden assets within 30 days, and to provide monthly financial statements to ensure compliance with the support order. If he failed to comply, he could be held in contempt of court and face possible jail time. Jessica was sitting in the gallery during the ruling, and I watched her face as Judge Hawkins read through the financial details. You could see her doing the math, realizing that the wealthy older man she'd been planning to marry was about to become significantly less wealthy. She left the courtroom alone. Richard was too busy huddling with his lawyer to pay attention to her exit. 3 weeks later, Jessica moved out of Richard's apartment and married a dentist she'd met on a dating app. Richard called me, drunk and crying, saying that Jessica had only been with him for his money and that she'd never really loved him at all. I listened to him ramble for about 5 minutes before hanging up. It was the last time we spoke. The house feels different now, but in a good way. It's mine in a way it never was before, and I've been making changes that I'd wanted to make for years but never could because Richard thought they were unnecessary or too expensive. I painted the living room a warm gold color that he always said was too bold. I turned his study into a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a reading chair by the window. I planted a garden in the backyard, something I'd been wanting to do since we first moved in, but never had time for when I was managing everyone else's needs before my own. Sarah visits more often now, and so do Michael and David. They were all devastated by their father's behavior, and I think they're trying to make up for his failures by being more present in my life. It's not necessary. I don't hold them responsible for their father's choices, but I appreciate the effort. We're building new relationships, adult relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. I've also been dating, which surprised everyone including myself. His name is Frank, and he's a retired history teacher who lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago. We met at the library, of all places, when he asked for help reaching a book on the top shelf. He's kind and funny and treats me like I'm precious rather than predictable. When I told him about Richard and the storm and the divorce, he was quiet for a long time before saying, "Any man who would abandon you doesn't deserve to call himself a man at all." Frank has never been wealthy like Richard was, but he's rich in all the ways that actually matter. He listens when I talk. He remembers things I tell him. He brings me flowers not because he's done something wrong, but because he was thinking of me and thought they might make me smile. When we travel together, and we travel quite a bit now, he asks what I want to see and do rather than just planning everything according to his preferences. Sometimes people ask me if I'm bitter about what happened, if I hate Richard for destroying our marriage and abandoning me that night. The honest answer is that I feel sorry for him more than anything else. He gave up 37 years of shared history, 3 wonderful children, and a woman who would have loved him unconditionally for the rest of his life, all for a 28-year-old who dumped him the moment his financial situation became complicated. He traded something real and lasting for something shallow and temporary, and now he's alone in a studio apartment, working extra hours to pay the spousal support he resents but can't avoid. Richard thought he was trading up when he chose Jessica over me. He thought younger meant better, that starting over meant getting a second chance at happiness. What he didn't understand is that happiness isn't about finding someone new to love you. It's about becoming someone worthy of love. And a man who abandons his wife of 37 years in a thunderstorm is not worthy of anyone's love. The storm that night was terrifying, but it was also liberating in a way I never could have imagined. Standing on that highway, soaked to the skin and abandoned by the person who was supposed to protect me, I discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. I found my way to safety, I fought for what I deserved, and I built a new life that's better than anything I had before. Richard thought the storm would wash me away, make me disappear quietly and conveniently from his life. Instead, it washed away everything that was weak and accommodating and afraid to stand up for myself. What emerged was someone I'd forgotten I could be. Someone confident and decisive and unwilling to settle for less than I deserve. These days, when storms roll through, I stand at my kitchen window with a cup of tea and watch the rain with something approaching fondness. Weather doesn't scare me anymore. Neither do lawyers or divorce proceedings or starting over at 62. I learned that night on Highway 47 that I could survive anything, even being abandoned by someone I'd loved for nearly 4 decades. Richard learned a different lesson, though I'm not sure he's fully grasped it yet. He learned that actions have consequences, that you can't just discard people who've loved you without paying a price. He learned that the woman he thought was weak and predictable actually had more steel in her spine than he'd ever possessed. Most importantly, he learned that when you bet everything on someone who only wants you for your money, you shouldn't be surprised when they disappear the moment that money becomes uncertain. I heard through mutual friends that Richard's law practice has been struggling since the divorce. Turns out that when your personal life becomes a public scandal, clients start questioning your judgment and your ethics. Several of his biggest corporate clients moved their business to other firms, and word spread quickly through the legal community about what he'd done. Lawyers might be willing to overlook a lot of things, but abandoning your wife in a thunderstorm crosses a line that even the most morally flexible attorney finds difficult to defend. Jessica, as I mentioned, moved on quickly once she realized that her sugar daddy's financial situation had become complicated. She married Dr. Kevin Walsh, a dentist who specializes in cosmetic procedures and drives a Tesla. I saw their wedding announcement in the society pages of the newspaper, and I have to admit I felt a moment of satisfaction reading about how she'd found true love so soon after Richard's resources became unavailable. Some women might have felt vindicated or pleased that Richard's rebound relationship had failed so spectacularly, but mostly I just felt grateful that I was no longer part of that particular drama. The truth is, Jessica did me a favor, though she certainly didn't intend to. If Richard hadn't met her, if he hadn't become so obvious about his dissatisfaction with our marriage, I might have spent another decade or two trying to fix something that was fundamentally broken. I might have continued pouring my energy into making him happy, never realizing that his unhappiness had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with his own inability to appreciate what he had. Frank and I have been together for almost 2 years now, and the difference between this relationship and my marriage is like the difference between sunlight and artificial lighting. Everything feels more natural, more authentic. When Frank tells me I look beautiful, I believe him because there's no agenda behind the compliment. No expectation that I need to earn his affection through constant accommodation and service. When he suggests we take a trip somewhere, it's because he genuinely wants to share the experience with me, not because he's checking something off a list of obligations. Last month, Frank and I drove up to Cedar Falls, the same little town where Richard and I had taken our disastrous final weekend trip. I'd been reluctant to go at first, worried that being there would bring back painful memories, but Frank suggested that maybe it was time to create some new associations with the place. He was right, as he usually is about these things. We stayed at a different bed and breakfast, a charming Victorian place with a wraparound porch and gardens full of wildflowers. The owners, an elderly couple named Helen and George, had been running the place for 30 years and treated us like beloved relatives rather than paying customers. Helen made fresh blueberry muffins every morning, and George regaled us with stories about the history of the area, while we sat on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Frank and I took long walks around the lake, something I'd wanted to do with Richard but never could because he was always too busy or too tired or too distracted by his phone. We visited the local antique shops and art galleries, had leisurely dinners at restaurants where we actually talked to each other instead of sitting in uncomfortable silence, and spent hours just sitting by the water, reading books and enjoying each other's company. On our last evening there, a thunderstorm rolled through the mountains, and I found myself standing on the porch watching the lightning dance across the sky without feeling even a trace of anxiety. Frank came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, and we stood there together listening to the thunder echo off the mountains. "Beautiful storm," he said quietly. Yes, I agreed, and I meant it. The storm was beautiful, powerful and dramatic and completely natural. It wasn't something to be feared or endured, just something to be experienced and appreciated for what it was. That night, lying in bed at the Victorian Inn with Frank sleeping peacefully beside me, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago. That Linda had been so focused on preserving her marriage that she'd forgotten to preserve herself. She'd been willing to accept crumbs of affection and attention from a man who'd already mentally checked out of their relationship. She'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd stayed with someone who made her feel lonely even when he was in the same room. I don't miss that version of myself, though I don't judge her either. She was doing the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. She believed that marriage was supposed to be about sacrifice and compromise, about putting your partner's needs ahead of your own, about making things work no matter what. She didn't understand that a good marriage should be a partnership between equals, not a one-sided service contract. The financial settlement from the divorce has given me security I never had before, even during the supposedly successful years of my marriage to Richard. Because while we lived well during those years, I was always aware that everything we had was contingent on Richard's goodwill and continued success. The house was in his name, the investment accounts were managed by him, and I had no independent source of income or assets. If something had happened to Richard, or if he decided to leave me before Jessica came along, I would have been left with very little. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I have true financial independence. The spousal support payments ensure a steady income, and the lump sum settlement has allowed me to make investments that will provide additional security for the future. I've also gone back to school, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I could justify when Richard's needs and the children's needs always came first. I'm working on a master's degree in library science, which combines my love of books with my desire to help other people access information and resources. The coursework is challenging and rewarding, and my classmates, most of whom are decades younger than me, have welcomed me with an openness and enthusiasm that surprised me. Being back in an academic environment has reminded me how much I enjoyed learning for its own sake, not just to support someone else's goals. My thesis project focuses on developing resources for women going through divorce, particularly older women who may not be familiar with digital research tools, or who may need help understanding their legal and financial options. It's work that feels meaningful and personal, drawing on my own experience while helping others who might be facing similar challenges. Sarah has been particularly supportive of my educational pursuits. She's proud of me for going back to school, she says, and she's glad to see me building a life that's centered on my own interests and goals rather than on managing everyone else's needs. She's also relieved that I'm happy, truly happy, in a way that she says she hadn't seen me be in years. "You're different now, Mom," she told me during her last visit. "More yourself, if that makes sense. When I was growing up, it always seemed like you were performing some version of yourself that you thought Dad wanted to see. Now you just seem like you." She's right about that. I am more myself now than I've been in decades. I wear clothes I like instead of clothes I think other people expect me to wear. I speak my mind instead of carefully calculating how my words might be received. I make decisions based on what I want rather than what I think I should want. It's liberating in a way I hadn't expected. The house has become truly mine in ways that go beyond the legal paperwork. I've redecorated it to reflect my tastes, rather than what I thought would impress Richard's colleagues, or create the right impression for his professional image. The living room now has comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than display. The kitchen has been updated with appliances I actually know how to use, rather than expensive gadgets that looked impressive, but served no practical purpose. I've also developed friendships that are based on genuine compatibility, rather than social obligation. During my marriage to Richard, most of our social circle consisted of other lawyers and their wives, relationships that were maintained more for professional networking than personal connection. I never felt entirely comfortable in those circles, always aware that I was being evaluated and judged according to standards I didn't fully understand or agree with. Now my closest friends are people I've met through school, through volunteer work at the library, and through the hiking group Frank introduced me to. These are relationships built on shared interests and mutual respect, and the conversations are about books and ideas and experiences rather than who's driving which car or whose children have gotten into which prestigious colleges. One of my closest friends now is Margaret, a woman in her 70s who went back to school for her PhD after her husband died. She's become something of a mentor to me, showing me what it looks like to reinvent yourself completely in the later decades of life. Margaret had been a traditional housewife for 50 years, and when her husband passed away, she discovered that she had interests and capabilities she'd never had the opportunity to explore. "The tragedy," Margaret told me once over coffee, "isn't that our marriages ended. The tragedy would have been if we'd continued to live half-lives just to avoid the discomfort of change." She's absolutely right about that. Change is uncomfortable, especially when it's forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control. But discomfort isn't the same thing as damage, and sometimes the things that feel most devastating in the moment turn out to be exactly what we needed to become who we were always meant to be. I think about that night on Highway 47 often, but not with bitterness or trauma. Instead, I think of it as the night I discovered who I really was beneath all the layers of accommodation and people-pleasing I'd built up over the years. Standing in that storm, abandoned and alone, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. I found out that I could take care of myself, that I could survive and even thrive without someone else managing my life for me. Richard thought that storm would wash me away, that I'd disappear quietly and conveniently from his life. Instead, it washed away everything that was weak and fearful and dependent, leaving behind someone who knows her own worth and refuses to settle for less than she deserves. Someone who can stand in any storm, whether literal or metaphorical, and trust in her ability to find her way to safety. If I could go back and talk to the woman I was that night, soaked and shivering on the side of Highway 47, I would tell her that everything she's about to lose needed to be lost. The marriage that felt like her whole world was actually just a small part of a much larger life she hadn't yet discovered. The man who abandoned her was doing her a favor, though it would take time for that favor to become apparent. I would tell her that the storm was just weather, temporary and manageable, but the strength she was about to discover in herself would last forever. I would tell her that being abandoned by someone who never truly valued her was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a much better chapter. Most of all, I would tell her that the best was yet to come.